Well, thank you all for coming today. Make yourself comfortable. My name is Kate Elliott. I write a lot of books. I'm here with...
I'm Roanhorse, and I expected like 15 people. So I was like, hey, let's do a circle and we'll all talk.
Clearly an intimate discussion.
Clearly I understand, but welcome. Thank you everybody for coming.
So we came up with this panel because I have written epic fantasy. I've been publishing for a really long time, but I've been publishing for 30 years. This year is the anniversary of my first published novel, not the first novel I wrote 30 years ago. And Rebecca had her first novel, Little Lightning, just came out 2 months ago.
Yeah, June 26th, my first novel came out. And of course I have a short story up for Kiko. My latest project, well, I have the Trail of Lightning series, it's called the Sixth World series, but my next separate project is an epic fantasy. So when it came time to write an epic fantasy, I was like, holy crap, I don't know what I'm doing. Because Trail of Lightning is more sort of a urban fantasy, science fantasy, westerny type thing. And I'm not very good at staying in my genre lines, so I really wanted to talk to someone like Kate, who knows what they're doing.
Well, her first mistake wasn't believing that I know what I'm doing. But actually, I thought, and I think we both thought, that it would be interesting just for people to kind of eavesdrop on two writers talking about writing epic fantasy, whatever that means. So why don't we start by figuring out, what does that mean? What is an epic fantasy?
Sure. And I'm open to questions from the audience too. I mean, I know Kate is too. So I assume that a lot of you in this room are writing epic fantasy or trying to write epic fantasy, and that's why you're here. So if there are questions or things that jump out at you, raise your hand. Okay, because we'll put you in a conversation.
I want to actually we didn't discuss this beforehand. We can either do the kind of questions as we go or save questions till the end. I don't care.
I like questions as you go.
All right, I'll let you handle that.
Okay. If it gets too crazy, because like I said, I thought there were going to be 15 people. If it gets too crazy, then we might ask you to hold them to the end. So we'll see.
And then my one other thing that we also didn't discuss when we had breakfast this morning, while I was drinking my copious amounts of caffeine, is that when people ask a question, we might need to repeat it because I have hearing loss. I can't always hear lovely people I know. Some of you are quiet enough.
Okay.
I can do
that.
Well, let's go then.
Okay, so so when I decided to write this epic fantasy, I've been an epic fantasy reader for all my life. Also a dance champion. No, not at all. I grew up reading, of course, Tolkien, but really Wheel of Time, the Bulgaria, things like that. Which
So young.
Oh, but
let's not go there.
And so, the thing about all those epic fantasies for me is they were always white. They were white farm boys, and they're going on these quests, and there was none of me in those. And at that age, it didn't really bother me because I thought, well, I'm a white farm boy too inside, that sort of thing. Don't quote me on that. But now, that I'm sitting down to write my own, and I wanted to pull, I'm okay with Gay Pueblo on my mother's side, and African American on my father's side, and I wanted to pull some of my cultural heritage into my epic fantasy because that's what speaks to me. Specifically, the Pueblo, which you might know as ancestral Puebloans as Anasazi. And so I live in New Mexico, in that area of the country, and that's where my ancestors are from, and the Anasazi are my ancestors. So I wanted to pull something from that, and that's sort of what set me on this path. But I guess I'm a little ahead of myself because we were going to address the question of what is an epic fantasy?
And you actually bring up something interesting, what you just said, which was ancestral paths. And I think that epics, oh man, there's like 3 things I want to say right now. This is why my books are so long. I think that epics happen in every culture, not just written down, but of course epics begin as part of an oral tradition, and I think epics often are ways in which people talk about what their history, and their history that goes way back into how things were created. I think those are kind of maybe the root of epics. They could be poetry, they could be stories, they could be a cycle of stories, they could be something written down that would have happened later. But you see this, that one of the things for me, about modern Western, and maybe specifically in publishing terms, US and British epic fantasy, is that it mostly comes out of this kind of a fairly narrow Western space, which is fine on the one hand, in the sense that there are great epics there. You know, the whole King Arthur mythos, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the whole Roland, I mean, there's the Nibelungen. All this is great stuff, right? But there's more. That's not the universal epic. It's kind of was taught to me, the Iliad and the Odyssey is the basis of all, right? But it's not all there is. And in fact, epic is, I don't want to say only, but it's part of it. It's threaded through all human cultures. And to me, one of the great things going on with epic fantasy in the current publishing market, because of course it was always the case in other places where I recently read the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a Persian epic, written down, or written in a prose version by Abdul Qasim Ferdowsi in the 10th century from a poetical or numerous poetical versions, which is kind of the history of the great civilization of Persia through this retelling of the various deeds of the kings. I could talk about that for a while. Anyway, but we don't. But in West, when I was first reading Tolkien, I didn't know about that because it wasn't taught to me. So I just like to see more the epic. I feel epic is more being slowly recaptured or re-expanded, or the arms are opening in our field, in our genre, to see more of that, which is already there. And then I can say one thing. You talked about what you read as a child. I imprinted on Tolkien when I was 13. But by the time I was, and the first fantasy I wrote with my best friend in ninth grade was, we drew a map and then we wrote about the adventures of these dudes, and they were dudes, right? But by the time I was 15, I was in a very outdoor tomboy, as they said in those days, a child, and I was just like so pissed off. Because that's what I wanted to do, but everything I read told me that wasn't what I was supposed to do. And I made a decision fairly early on in high school when I started writing that stuff, but pretty seriously, that I was going to put women in those stories. And I just made that decision, and that's basically the impetus of my entire career. I'm going to put women in those stories. And of course they were already there in various ways, but I just wanted to, in publishing terms, put them in.
Well, so you said something interesting, Kate, that epic fantasy is sort of this history of our ancestors, or the history of a culture, even if it's a completely imaginary culture that you've made up. So one of the things I did when I started is I Googled what is epic fantasy. And a couple of different, not everyone agrees, so that's sort of a good thing, I guess, but a couple of things that came up had to do with scope and scale. And so when you're talking about the history of a people, I think that those are the primary sort of defining features of epic fantasy, is that you're taking in a large, sort of a long view of history, and it's massive. Like, it often covers a continent. That's why you have all these questing stories, right? Because people have to travel. Also, we had talked earlier about how often it includes God. And I don't think it has to be epic to include gods. I include gods in my work that's not. But then there's also the issue of when it takes place. Can you write a contemporary epic fantasy? Can you set an epic fantasy in the here and now? Does it have to be medieval? Does it have to have magic? I assume so. But if it has magic, can it have science? Can there be romance elements in your epic fantasy? And can it take place in space? Because I'm very interested to know. So those are sort of some of the issues that I'm wrestling with as I try to write my book. And we had talked a little bit about what goes into the world building of your epic fantasy. And I think some of it is pretty straightforward. Everybody wants to commit math at some point. But what are the issues that maybe you overlook when you're writing epic fantasy? Things that all cultures have or all societies have that really, to give your world building depth, needs to be there. And some of the surprising ones we had talked about were celebrities and sports. And those are two of my favorite things to include in epic fantasy in general. When you read something like, Kate, you talked about your series with the ball court.
The Cold Magic series, the Spirit Walker series. Yeah, and in the middle volume, Cold Fire, they would go to, this is an alternate history fantasy because there's magic set in those who haven't read it, set in a alternate history in which an extended ice age, and there's a magical pseudo-scientific reason, but I worked with a physicist, so there can be science, in which, with an extended ice age means Germanic tribes never developed, or never developed in Europe, so the Northern European nation states never developed. The story takes place in about the equivalent of 1838, I think, or 18, I can't remember, I wrote it a while ago. And so you have a world that is framed very differently. But at one point, in the book 2, heroine goes to the Americas, which have not been, so this is the Americas of the 1818, which have not been colonized by the Northern Europeans. So it's a different world. But does anyone here know what the ball courts in Mesoamerica are? When I was young, you see them across the entire Mesoamerican culture region, from north to south. They're just everywhere. So it was clearly a larger cultural thing that even in related cultures and neighbor cultures, that it had extended all the way through this culture area. Now, when I was young, it was, what we were taught about that was that they played this game in the ball court and then the losing team was sacrificed. As I said to you at breakfast, that would sure limit your number of great games you could have. But I use that game because it's endemic. It's everywhere in that culture. So it was clearly, so I did what research I could to find out how it might have been played. And then it's incorporated, not as a major plot point, but the sense that it's a cultural thing. But what it does is get across that sense of, and I want to come back to your thing about what makes an epic, scope and scale, and the sense that there are larger patterns in cultures that you can see, and also in the ways that cultures interact and the way that cultures are related. And that, I think epic is a great place to show both change, conflict, and the ways cultures develop over time and the ways people interact within them in a very large scale. My answer to your question is, do there need to be gods, is no, although there can be. But I think epic needs cosmology. There has to be a sense for the writer. And I don't think every book needs this, but I think an epic, people need to think about, or there needs to be a sense of who are we and how are we in the universe? How do we relate to the universe? Because I think epic creates that it's very rooted form. And that comes back to the past. So it's about rootedness, but also about movement.
And so let's talk even a little bit about this idea. We talked about movement of the quest. Does epic have to have a quest in it?
No. My rule is you can make anything work if you can make it work. So I think we're used to the quest. It's like the Joseph Campbell monument, right? It's like have to have. And then you realize that it's not a universal myth. It's a story about a dude, right? Nothing against that. It's a good story, but it's not the only story. It's not the main story. So there's a lot of ways There's, for instance, in the Shahnameh, which is absolutely epic, there is not a quest. There might be a few, there's stories where people go places where the king has to go fight the other people. Actually, it's mostly about people fighting other people. And women looking out the window. I'm sorry, I have to say this. Just the prejudices, that I realize that I've carried with me all these years. So there's, in the early portions, the last third is different, but in the early portions of the Shahnameh, there's all these stories about the ladies are sitting up in their wing of the palace, and look at that hot guy down there by the river. Ladies and my servants, go down, talk to him, and tell him to come into my window. And he comes up to her window, and she raises him up on his window, and for 3 days they ate a lot and had a party. And I'm like, all right, I'm there.
Like an epic.
That's epic. You guys, that is epic. If you can make it work.
So, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, just on the idea you mentioned earlier about ethics and other cultures, talking about history, have you thought about the possibility of like a future anthropologist, like far off, reading your ethic and assuming it's what we believe about the world right now?
So the question is, have either of us or anyone thought about future anthropologists reading our work and wondering if that's our world? Or it says something about us? Well, I think, so epics might they might be historical in the sense of like we're trying to write this history, but they're certainly of the moment. The epic that I write is going to feel very 2020, hopefully, when it comes out. Just like some of the ones we grew up with feel very dated now. The ones written even in the 80s, 70s, and 80s and stuff, and we see them as problematic, things like that. So I think they capture a moment in the culture. So in that sense, sure. In the sense of like, oh, well, this is what the society was like or something, the society that I'm making up.
I absolutely agree that we're not writing about, I believe we are not writing about the past. I don't believe science fiction is predictive about the future. If it was, those dudes back in the 50s and 60s would predicted birth control, and strangely, they didn't. So it says we're writing to ourselves, and we're writing about our day. But at the same time, I do think that future anthropologists can look at things and say, hey, this tells us something a lot about the early 20th century. I just think that the stuff I suspect that the stuff that's going to survive and the stuff that they're going to find interesting might surprise us now. Who knows? I don't know, who knows? We don't know what is going to be 1,000 years from now, the equivalent thing that people are going to go, whoa, this is absolutely the most amazing 21st century thing. It could be something that we simply don't expect because we have our own biases and prejudices about, as we all know, about what is worthy and what should be visible, which actually brings me back to this idea of expanding epic into areas that currently maybe have been neglected as being important or visible. One of the reasons that I wanted to write women into my epic fantasy, so that you could see women after a long period in which women's roles were shrunk so small, which isn't the case in many when you go back into medieval. If you go back in time, you can find more roles for women. So you talk about expanding the epic map.
Sure. And so what I wanted to do clearly was include indigenous people as main characters, not as a laconic horse culture, which is what you see, like, I'll never forget the Bulgaria. And it's not, it's also in the Malazan, all sorts of things where you get these nomadic horse cultures, and that is your indigenous culture, where people like the Anasazi, built high-rises and sophisticated cultures that lived in cities and had massive trade all over, what we now call North and Central America, South America even. So there's a rediscovering, I think, of other ways to tell the story or who to center in this story that interests me specifically. And of course, it's always been everywhere. That's not even a question.
We weren't just in
As we're not people of color, so, right. We wouldn't-
That was nice.
that was a little later. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about craft, actually, some of the really stuff like pacing and tone and point of view, like really practical elements in writing your epic fantasy that I'm struggling with.
These are the ones she thinks I have all the answers to. Again, that piece of bad news, I'm still figuring this out.
Right. So one of the givens it seems in epic fantasy is that it's this third person point of view, right? You have multiple points of view because you're telling this grand sort of story. And when I was Googling what is epic fantasy, I did come across an article that said you should write it in third person omniscient, right? So that you know everything that's going on and it really helps you bring it all together and everything. And I don't know that I can do that, frankly, because as much as I would like to be God, I'm not God. And I'm not sure that I want to be. I like my stories intimate. I like to write about characters. I like the sort of interplay, the closeness. I actually like first person a lot, but I'm writing this epic fantasy in third person close. But then I was wondering, well, how many characters is too many? Like so someone had mentioned that they read an epic fantasy that had 20 point of view characters. He has so I did an analysis of Game of Thrones. Which I shouldn't have bothered because then afterwards I was like, I wonder if someone's already done this. But because actually I analyzed Game of Thrones because I wanted to understand his pacing and how many points of view George used in that first book. And surprisingly, I sort of think of epic fantasy, it has to be sort of stately and upscale, and we're sort of gazing into the distance sort of thing. His chapters are like 9 to 13 pages long. They're short and they're fast and they're snappy. And in that first book, he only has like 9 major character point of views. So actually that's a lot. I was thinking like 4 or 5, and I'm feeling like it's maybe a little overwhelming. But so 9 is a lot to manage, but you have 9 major character point of views. You have 9 to 13 pages in your chapters. It's not so hard. You can sort of manage that. I thought that was interesting.
Boy, do I have a lot to say about this. Okay, so Brent Weeks is another example of someone who writes big, large epic fantasy books with short, snappy chapters. So you can write long chapters with slower pacing. That was more stylistically acceptable. Readers' tastes have shifted, and this is one of those cases where I think people should write whatever they want. If they want to sell a book or and you can sell. And today we have so many options. We talk about like hybrid, traditional publishing, online, and everything. But sometimes it's important to understand that reading tastes shift, and currently, and it will change again. Currently, people like that faster pace. There's more readers who want that. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm not saying you have to do it, but it's going to bring in more people if that's your goal. But what I wanted to say about number of characters is, for me, I think you can have as many characters as you can handle. There's a couple of tricks to it. The first one, for me personally, and again, the rule is if you can make it work, then it works. But for me, if I'm going to have more than 2 characters, I don't like. I once picked up a book that started in like the first, I think they must have had like 6 point of view characters. And we just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the time I opened it and started chapter 5, which was a whole 5th new point of view, I closed the book and I didn't go back. It was too many shifts of scenes for me immediately. So there are techniques to use if you're doing multiple points of view, where you can start with character A. Maybe that's going to be your main character, the biggest thread you're going to follow. Or maybe there's something else going on with them, which is why you need to start with them. I'm not going to deal with prologues here for a second. Then you can introduce character. You might stay with them for 2 chapters. If you stay with them for too long, people will get confused when you switch out. But if you stay with them for a chapter or 2, they go to B, then go back to A, then either come back to B or go to C. Then you can start, then come back to B and then A again, so that maybe A has the most chapters and they're kind of the thread that's linking you together. Then by the time you get up to your ninth character, you're later in the book, people are grounded and they understand, this is the main thing, they understand the context that fifth or eighth character, they understand the context that that character functions in. Because when you introduce a new character and a new function or a setting, a plot, that's a huge amount of information to take in. As Michelle Segarra says, also, it says Michelle West. She's talking specifically about the opening of a novel. With the opening of a novel, you can have a familiar action in an unfamiliar setting, or a familiar setting with an unfamiliar action. So we can be sitting in this room and the door opens and, sorry, I got excited. We could be sitting in this room and the door opens and some supernatural creature walks in. So we all have sat, well, not everybody has, but many people have sat in a room like this, but then the supernatural creature is the unfamiliar element, you get where I'm going. So, and then Michelle's cast series, the casting, shadow casting series, starts with a young woman who's employed as a detective and she's late for work. Well, who hasn't been late for work, right? Somebody out there, I don't want to talk to them. But she's in a magical world, so she has to use the mirror to call in, to say that, hey, I'm running late, and then there's, and so that, but we're grounded in that. So that's what happens with characters. You want to ground them. You don't want to give us too much information. And I'll add one more thing, because I have so many things. I spent so long figuring out how to do this. And another way to introduce new characters is to link them to what just happened. So you might say, we're sitting here talking, and I might say, 2 years ago, Ken Liu and I did a panel like this. That was a dialogue at WorldCon Kansas City. Bam! Now we can start Ken, right? Ken is in Boston working on the third book of, if you haven't read Grace of Kings, it's a great epic fantasy. And the first two books are out. He's doing revisions on the third. Now we can go to Ken laboring thing. I wish I was there talking like that. Now we've got that link. So now he's not a complete new thing. We have a connection to him in the way that we pull into him. And that allows you, so you can do that either by simple things like thinking about it, or an action like I'm talking on my cell phone. I picked up my cell phone, and then someone is on, either the person on the other end of that call, right, is your new point of view. So if you connect those things, then the reader doesn't have to make 2 or 3 jumps. They only need to make 1. And that allows you to bring in characters up until you have a lot. And then, yeah. Oh wait, one more thing. Sorry. And then the other thing for me personally, I have to do this, is I like to if I'm going to have a lot of characters, I either like to have a very simple spine of a plot. So the plot is simple, but all these people's stories are wrapped around it. Or that's the simplest way. And I forgot what the other one was, so you have to go on.
Yeah, I read something, and I see the 2 questions. I will get to you. I read something that said that one of the good things, like for example, Game of Thrones is going to be my go-to all the time, is you have the plot is everybody wants the throne, right? Everybody wants the same thing, and then you have all these characters and all these sort of stories around it. So the plot is really simple. But you can sort of branch off and you can do all these different complicated relationships and family dynamics and all sorts of things, whole wars around that. But really, the plot is just everybody wants to throw. I thought that was cool. And then I want to talk about information density, but first I had a question here.
It's a comment. As a reader, I've read a lot of books with lots of shift changes of points, and the one that messes me up is when the author decides that every time they shift the point of view, they're going to leave a cliffhanger. So you're reading and you get to a cliffhanger, you flip the page, and it's a different character.
I will never apologize for my cliff. I'm leaving you on a cliff, so you will keep reading. Sorry.
I'm just letting you know that what I do is then I skip the next several chapters and pick up where I want to, and then I come back. So I don't read it in the order that you want me to read it.
And I had a question over here.
I'm really trying to make this question succinct, so apologies ahead of time. When you're thinking about a fantasy or any story that's not an epic, it's usually focused around one character, and that character has an arc that resolves in some way by the end of the story. With a fantasy, usually the arc of the plot is bigger than one single character because you have so many people involved. When you're building a fantasy story, it's possible that not every character in your giant narrative will move or will have a resolution by the end of the book. How important is that to have every character sort of have a meaningful evolution of ending that takes place?
I always have an answer, even if it's completely pointless, but. I'm not.
Oh, sure. I'll repeat it.
Okay.
She asked how important it is for all your characters to have a complete arc. When you're like managing 9 points of view, does everyone have to have growth, right? Or can you just have flatness?
And I'm assuming here, I'm going to answer this question as if we're talking about a complete story, whether that story takes place in a single volume, 3 volumes, 20 volumes, or whatever. What I like to do when I think of characters is think of them in kind of primary, secondary, tertiary roles. So a primary character will be one of the, usually I don't have more than like 3 of those even in a more multi-point of view thing. And they are people who have a full arc. They go through an emotional journey or a psychological journey as well as a physical journey. Secondary characters will have, usually the thing about journeys and resolutions is resolutions can be very small and still satisfying. So you might have the sidekick who has a wonderful bantering role with the thing, and their sole goal is to get to their grandmother's 100th birthday party, right? And so they go through all this stuff and they get to their grandmother's 100th birthday party, and that's great. You're glad for them because they're not a primary character. That they succeeded at that level was good enough, right? So a resolution doesn't have to be big. It can be small. And then tertiary, for me, tertiary, and then I even get tertiary characters might be people who have a few lines, still a little bit of, they cast a bit of a shadow, and then you might have like on the ordinary level, just spear carrier, someone who's like, there was a person standing at the door, there were guards standing at the door, I walked past them, right? But you can, so you can relegate that, you can create a resolution that works. I do think characters who are point of view characters need it by the end of the story to have some feeling of satisfaction for the reader, even if it's small. And don't underestimate the importance of small things in our lives and therefore in the lives of our characters.
So I did say I wanted to talk a little bit about information density. One of the things that Kate and I were talking about is how much do you make up in your fantasy, in your epic fantasy, and then how much can you just take from real life? Like I am reading the 5th season right now, so I'm a little slow, apologies, but I'm getting to it now. And one of the things I think that Kate Jemison does is interesting, that struck me, because I'm trying to figure this out, is she uses miles. And we talked about like using coffee. So if you are writing an epic fantasy that takes place in the secondary world that you just made up, or that takes place in another culture, like I'm pulling, sort of this faux Anasazi space culture, can I use miles? Or is that jarring? Is that weird? Do I have to make up something about paces? Do I have to, come up with some whole system of measurement in order to lend authenticity to this world that I'm looking at? And I'll let Kate talk about that, but I think we talked about what matters to your story, right? And so if making up, well, go ahead, you had the answer to that. I'll let you repeat it.
I raised 3 kids, so I'm glad I have the answer to something. Yeah, there's two things about information that's in it. It is hard, isn't it? It's because you want to make up this, well, I'm a big world opener. I'm like the world opening door. And I could just put in everything because I find it so fascinating, probably far more fascinating than 99% of my readers do with too many details. So, but what I've learned over time is two things. One thing is that when people say that opening was really fast, that opening really moved fast, what they often mean is I didn't have to absorb a lot of new information. It took me a long time to figure this out. It's not about having an action scene at the beginning necessarily. You can, but it doesn't have to be. Moving fast means that I can process, as the reader, I can process this stuff really quickly because a lot of it is familiar to me. And that has its own problems, which is that whole business of defaulting to the dominant culture, because you go with things that most everyone would recognize, and then if you have to introduce things that might be new to people, then they have to process, or they might take a step back, or they might say, what does this mean? Or there's 3 made-up terms on page 1. I can't go any farther with this. So there's part of that is starting with more familiar things and then beginning to layer in your other things. And then the other thing, you're talking about miles, is deciding what matters enough in the story, to the story, in the culture you're writing, that you want to change the word, and you want to introduce a non-dominant culture reference. So if traveling isn't that, if people travel, but the act of traveling isn't that important to the story, then miles is a good translation as any. You know, it's from the Roman roads, love roads. I can't wait for the roads. You're going to have roads, right?
Main road.
But yeah, so what I sort of came up with at breakfast is, but what? What if you live in a culture where the cosmology is that an important religious figure was stabbed with a sword at this point on the road and walked this far before they fell down and something happened there that was deeply spiritual. That might be your measure of distance. In that case, it's worth being part of the story. And so it's not just about roads, obviously, but think about the thing. So coffee, do you have to, you see that sometimes, right? People say, well, it's a secondary fantasy world. Why are they calling it coffee? Well, why not? That's a translation of the word. Or our version of it, or my English version of this word that in something, it's like you guys know about the chai-tea boundary? Yeah. And why it's called chai in some places and tea in others, and why you should never say chai-tea, because it's tea. But anyway, that's an interesting, fascinating linguistic and colonial, historical thing that these words, the way the words spread and the way they change. So, to me, when you're writing epic, decide, don't make everything important. Don't make 10 or 20 things important. Tessa Grattan once said that she picks 3 things that she wants to highlight. And I'm not saying that you need to pick 3 things, but that's just her way of coping with it. That she picks 3 things, so like it might be architecture and roads. I don't know. A big poem that everybody knows about and how it plays into the culture or something, whatever. I just made that up. But figure out, if you're going to give me new information, make sure that it matters to the story and the characters too. And otherwise, I think it's okay to use stuff that's more familiar so people don't have to dig constantly through trying to figure it out. Because you don't want to lose your reader. And there are readers who love the details, and that's great too. But if you're going for your audience needs to embrace.
So you have to hold back your desire to make up Welsh-looking words. Stick that in there. Okay, so here's, how are we doing on time? Oh, okay, great. Questions? I'm going to take a moment. Yeah, go ahead.
As far as writing information density, as far as writing fantasy characters and fantastic elements and real historical settings, what are some tips that you're using the actual historical experience to inform your characters of something. But you don't want to involve the minutia of a specific historical time period that you're in. And so if you do decide to plot and everything else that these details about, like if you're writing something World War I, World War II, whatever, and you just get lost in minutia, we give some tips or advice, like a balance. Just if you guys can comment on something like that.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Can you repeat the question?
I just recently read.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. Yes, how do you not get lost? So if you're writing, let's say, in a historical setting, but you're putting fantastical elements into that setting, how do you not get lost in the minutiae? Like, what is the balance between the historical and the fantastical?
Yes.
Right. And so I just recently read Daniel Jose Older's Dactyl Hill Squad. It's a middle grade. It's a civil war with dinosaurs. It's adorable, and you guys should totally read it. It's awesome. But, you know, he takes on issues like the draft riots. There's a lynching in the book. There's slavery. Like, it is serious elements of the book having to do with the Civil War, but with kids and with dinosaurs. And he does, I think, a masterful job of keeping that fantastical element, you know, and keeping sort of the fantasy of kids riding dinosaurs, and there's a girl who's like basically like a dinosaur whisperer and stuff. But with like the real historical things that happen. And, you know, and like the draft riots really happen. Or there's an orphanage for colored children that gets burned down in the book, and that's real, that really happened. And so how he weaves his characters into that, because they're orphans at that orphanage that gets burned down, and, you know, and what they see and everything is, I think he does a great job of balancing that. I'm trying to figure that out too. Like, I don't want to write, you know, an 11th or 12th century, you know, Anasazi story, because that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to write like a fantasy story. So when do I bring in the magic? Do I need to bring it in early? You know, is this magic that sort of looks sciencey? Is it sciencey that sort of looks magic? Like, you know, do I have to be really literal when I'm climbing, you know, cliffs, or, you know, can I sort of wing it? No pun intended. You know, so things like that. Yeah, and I think it's a question. It's a good question. I think you have to always be asking yourself that question. And I'm also going to see if Kate has a better answer.
I don't have a better answer. I just have more answers. I haven't read Daniel's book, so I don't like it. But I can read it soon, so then I'll like it. You know, it's a great question. First of all, there's a couple of things I would say. First of all, many cultures don't see the fantastical as antithetical to the real world. And I think that's like just that recognition. I think that in a certain aspect of the many cultures don't see those two things as antithetical. And so it's important to understand, again, that even if you never use cosmology, even if you don't really deal with religion in an epic or really in anything, you kind of got to understand how people interact with the world around them and how they see the cosmology of the existence they themselves as individuals are living. And if there's no space between, no barrier between the natural and the supernatural, then they just coexist. So that's one way to look at it. Think about how that functions. Maybe it just functions in that society in a different way than maybe this society's dominant culture would tend to look at it. Another thing is that I think it's always fine to wallow in the minutia, especially when you're doing research, because it's amazing. It's amazing to find out new things. How cool is that, right? Seriously. But then when you put in those 10 details, what happens is that people can't pick out anything from them because they get hit with too much. And believe me, I know, because if you ever read my 7th volume of Epic Fantasy Crown of Stars, it is chock full of details. And if I could do anything to that book, and I love that series, I love it, but if I could do anything to it, I would go through and I would find places where I have 3 details and I would pick the one that matters to tell me what I need that scene to know. Or that character to see, that thing where like if a character, what would that character notice? That character wouldn't notice the same thing I would. What that character would notice might be a detail that tells me something about the culture, whether it's a historical aspect of it or a tactical aspect. But would also tell me something about who that character is, because Kat in the whole magic book, she's always noticing people's clothes. I don't know people's clothes except to say, oh, that's cool, right? Because she knows Kat. I mean, so it tells me something about the character and them too. So, and then I want to say, you said you're writing. This is great. You said you're writing about out of the Anasazi, but you're writing the 21st century, right? Whether or not that involves space or not is not the issue, but this is something I've learned kind of the hard way, which is, let me give an example from my own life. So in 2009, we went to Cambodia because I always wanted to go to the Angkor Wat complex. It was this Angkor complex, which is the Khmer civilization, which, sorry about it, it's just like from the 9th to the 13th century flourished. And these rulers would build, because the temples were stone, but then the cities around them were wood, they would build these temples. So like I would build my temple, and then my son would, and then the city would come up around it, and then my son would build over here, and then maybe it would go off into a branch line, and they would build something over there. So you have over this huge area, these surviving temples, and the cities are pretty much gone because they were wood. But the stonework, the carving, is just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And that means that there's a lot of people carving statues for tourists. And one of the things that we did there, we bought this Saw's crafting card. We bought this. It's a deva. It's one of the queens or goddesses. I don't know. It's just so beautiful. But remember that there are people probably trying to do 21st century art. Who's buying that? What am I doing as a tourist in their country buying only this stuff based on what was there 800 years ago? So what you're doing is it's like cultures don't stop. They change. And that's also part of what epic should be doing. When you said, should there be contemporary epic? Well, probably should, because we need to be living now and making it now and not freezing it in a past that we don't really understand anyway, because we're not there.
Are we out of time?
Yeah.
You're clapping next door. All right.